Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
And tonight we're going to be talking about restorative justice and restorative practices. And joining me tonight is Robin McNair, an educator and someone who actually does consulting and training in the area of restorative practices. Thank you so much for being here, Robin.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, Catherine.
So this has been kind of a journey because we actually met in August in Atlanta.
Yes.
I happened to come to a panel and you were one of the panelists, and it was a very interesting discussion, and as soon as I knew that you were from the DC area, I'm like, I need to have you on the show. Mm-hmm. So explain a little bit about how you were brought into that panel and in sort of the subject matter of that panel and how it fits in with a larger examination of why we need to consider restorative practices.
All right, Kathy. So the panel was Black girls and the school to prison pipeline. And the focus was on why there's so many African American females who are being funneled into the criminal justice system. And I've been doing restorative practices and restorative justice in my classroom for 3 years. And I was asked by one of the young ladies from the National Women's Law Center to actually be a panelist, just to discuss what I do in my classroom to help my African-American females stay in the classroom and not put out.
Right, and so you were teaching 8th grade, I believe?
9th grade.
9th grade,
yes.
And so that is that's at the very earliest stages of adolescence.
It is.
And so there's all kinds of factors having to do with adolescence. We talk about that a lot on this show actually too, is that there are things that are appropriate to children at different ages. And I think one of the things that we need to examine when we look at restorative practices is here in Virginia, we have a very high percentage of school suspensions every year, and 20% of those are elementary school students.
Wow.
Right? So how do we decide what is it appropriate for a 9th grader, what is appropriate for a 4th grader, what is it appropriate for a kindergartner?
Right.
A kindergartner. Has what we know about education kept up with the reality of what's happening in the classroom?
No, it has not. As a matter of fact, that has been the hardest things to change. For example, when you start talking about, changing the culture of a school, changing the mindset of people who've been teaching for so long, they don't want to change. So when you look at where our children were, 10, 15 years ago and where they are now in advance with technology, they don't want to see, okay, well, because this has advanced, we've got to advance too as educators. They want to continue to do the same thing they've been doing. And that doesn't work for our children today. And it's very important that we start doing practices and looking at the whole child and youth development and understanding, this 4th grade student is going to act very different than this 9th grade student. So we need to look at what this 4th grade student needs, but this 9th grade student is going to act very different from this 12th grade student. So we need to look at what this 9th grade student needs instead of taking it across the board. Every student needs to behave the same way.
And so is part of our blind spot the very idea that we're not looking at social and emotional learning as being as important as the academics, which are more easily measured?
Kathy, that's a misconception that so many people have. They think, well, we just need to go and push this textbook in front of them, give them these problems to do, and they should get it. But if you don't take care of that social and emotional piece of a child, they're not going to get it cognitively. Studies have been done to say that the executive function of a person doesn't really mature until 25 years old. So think about this child that's 9. Think about a child that's 14. Think about a child that's 18 years old. Their executive function is not working to its full capacity. So they're still in that learning stage, that teach me stage, that train me, correct me stage. And that's what we need to focus on. How can we teach social and emotional skills to the students so they can, know how to respond, behaviorally when there's conflict. And restorative practices does that.
So this whole idea of restorative practices really is placing responsibility on the child for, first of all, understanding in a fundamental way, and to me this is developing empathy.
Yes.
What they did wrong and who was harmed.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, restorative practices allow students to learn those social and emotional skills as it's happening in real life.
And as it applies
in
to
real
them.
life circumstances.
Like they've got skin in this game.
Exactly, exactly. So authentically, they're learning the skills that they need to know for the rest of their lives. And that's what restorative practices does.
But we were both students at some point in our lives. It was about maintaining discipline in the classroom. I mean, the goal is that in order to teach the material, you had to maintain order in the classroom. And we got this very punitive model of how you enforce discipline in a classroom.
Right.
And it is unfortunately mirrored a lot of our criminal justice system.
It did. It did. In 1994, when you had the Guns Free Schools Act come about, specifically because of the tragedy of Columbine, everything turned into zero tolerance. All right? Zero tolerance. If you bring something to school that resembles a weapon, you're gone, expelled. And it funneled down to other behaviors. Now these behaviors became subjective. You're disrespectful. You're disrupting the learning environment. You have to go. Zero tolerance policies. And that's the way it was for so many years. And now we're trying to turn that around by focusing on, okay, what's the root cause of the behavior? One of the things about restorative justice is that it gives students a voice. It allows students to be heard. And when a child does act out, the only thing a child is saying is, I want you to see me, look at me, because there's a need that's not being met.
And that's one of the core principles of restorative practices that really captivated me, is that students want to be seen, heard, and respected.
Yes. You know, it's funny because educators will always say, that child is disrespectful. That child doesn't respect adults. Are you respecting that child?
Right. How are they supposed to learn acceptable behaviors if we don't treat them in the way that we want them to act toward other people? That, to me, is the whole foundation of why this is so important.
That's true. Treat a child with dignity. That's one of the principles of restorative justice and restorative practices. Treat a child with dignity. Treat a child with respect. And when that child knows that you genuinely care about them, then they will cooperate with you. There was a study that was done using restorative practices, and it showed that those people who felt like those teachers who felt like students were respectable, those same students felt like those teachers were respectable.
So it was mutual. Like, yeah, I felt respected, and therefore I respected the person who respected me.
Yes.
To me, that is not a very difficult thing to understand.
It's not. And students will do things for you. For example, when you think about authority, if a person in authority works with the student instead of doing things to the student for the student, that child will respond more positive.
Right, because here's the other thing too that's another interesting point about restorative practices, is that you've got the goals that you have for the student, you have the goals you have for the teacher, but then you have something called community goals. What kind of classroom, what kind of school, what kind of culture do you want to have? And I've never really heard it broken out that way, that there are separate goals that should be met in order for it all to come together.
In my classroom, Kathy, one of the things that I do is something called respect agreements. And with respect agreements, I have the students to say, okay, tell me what a classroom looks like when a student is respecting the teacher, when a teacher is respecting the student, when students are respecting one another, and when everyone is respecting facilities. And this situation is a little different because students don't think about, wow, my teacher's going to respect me. So when we fill those 4 spaces out and I start writing them down, everyone comes into agreement with them, and that becomes our goals to make sure our classroom is a community, to make sure our classroom is a classroom of respect. It amazes them, and they respond positively to me.
And is that a matter really truly of, first of all, creating a vocabulary?
Yes.
Creating concepts that are age appropriate that they can understand, and then truly creating a sense of responsibility, that everyone has to be responsible, that we're all in this classroom together, and therefore when one person steps out of line,
yes,
it creates a problem for all of us, but all of us need to be part of solving it.
Right. And that's one of the things that restorative practices does as well. It allows everyone to be involved in the problem solving aspect of what happened. Students take responsibility, but students will also tell me what they're going to do to make it right. They, of course, harmed, or, you know, there was a conflict and there was a harm between, you know, two people. Then we talk about what happened. We talked about what were you thinking? You know, who do you think you were affected by this behavior? Now, what can you do to make it right? And the students make those decisions.
But, and again, there has to be a way to make this age appropriate for the very youngest child. Like when one sibling hits another one and they're 2 and 3 at home,
Right.
you know, parents have to mediate that, not just by pulling them apart and punishing one of them, but to understand, for the perpetrator to understand what they did wrong and why they should choose not to do it again. So I don't understand in schools why we aren't taking the time, and maybe that is the issue, why are not taking the time to create these lessons starting in preschool and kindergarten, so by the time they get to middle school and high school, they really do understand what the expectations are.
Right. Once again, we talk about policy. No child left behind. Once No Child Left Behind, and schools became, you know, fearful of them being taken over by their state, everybody started focusing on the tests, standardized tests, meeting the scores. Children became a number instead of children being human beings in front of a teacher. And that's what the focus was. So every second of the day, minute of the day, hour of the day had to be spent on making sure this student has the skill for this test. But you don't think about that child that hasn't had breakfast. You don't think about that child who was up all night because their parent was beaten.
Right.
You know, so they're coming to school with trauma. You're not meeting that need that that child has. But you got to make sure
That they pass
that
the
you get
test.
this test. Behavior might be off the chart that day because of what the child experienced. So guess what? They push him out. And what happens? That child still doesn't do well on the test.
So no one wins. The child
Exactly.
loses, and the classroom loses, and the test scores suffer anyway.
Yes.
You know, that is so short-sighted, and I have to say that you would think in this age where so much research not only has been done, but it's so readily available everywhere, academic papers, you can find this information online, why we have not decided that we should be putting social and emotional learning closer to the top.
Yeah.
So when we get back, we're going to discuss with Robin McNair some more about restorative justice and restorative practices and what she is doing and what she is seeing in the classroom. And quite frankly, I think this is an issue all of us need to care about if we care about the future of children becoming adults in our community. So please join us after the break.
Guess what? I have some news for you. There's free food right there, junk food. You see that truck? Oh, jeez. It's a 2 Michelin star chef. All for free, ladies and gentlemen. All for free.
Here we have a panzanella with summer vegetables and pesto. Enjoy. How we doing?
So what do you got going on underneath that plate there?
This food is really about to be thrown away.
Yeah.
Is there something wrong with this food? Where did you get it from?
From farmers markets. They put aside the ugly vegetables and the ugly fruits.
Carrot top, soft avocados. It was all food that was going to be discarded.
Even the drink you had is made from like a little bruised peach. Did it taste a little bruised?
Great. It's good.
The average person throws away 24 pounds of food a month. That's a lot. Isn't that a lot? Go visit SaveTheFood.com for more information. Thank you. Junk food time!
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. Tonight we're talking about restorative justice and restorative practices with Robin McNair, an educator and someone who consults and trains on restorative justice and restorative practices. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So when we talk about some of the great problems in every community, especially with high school dropouts, you end up with young people who are unemployable, uneducated. We wonder why they end up in situations where they commit crimes. And yet, let's go back to when they're kindergartners, first graders, second graders, third graders. You know, does every small child who goes to public school ever think that they're going to be a dropout?
Right.
No. I don't think so. I think 5-year-olds show up thinking they're going to be astronauts and firemen and doctors,
pilots,
and everything. So what happens? What happens in the school environment? Because I think it can't all be just the cycle of family poverty. I get that. But there is something happening in the schools that takes away from these bright 5-year-olds this idea that they can be anything.
Right. Well, basically, Kathy, when you think about the push out and during the zero tolerance era, which we're pushing to eliminate completely, preschoolers were also being suspended, you know, for being preschoolers. And when you start pushing them back out of the classroom and back into the home, back into the community where there is poverty, then where does the child's hope come from? So if they're at home living in this traumatic, you know, situation, poverty,
lack of supervision,
incarcerated parents, drug abuse in the community, gangs, they go to school and that's their escape. So that's where their hope comes from. But if you have a school that's going to push them out because they don't know how to self-regulate, then you send them right back out there and they lose that hope. And one suspension doubles a child's chance of being pushed into the juvenile justice system.
See, this is the thing I do not believe that the average person understands. Whether you've got kids in school or your kids are out of school or you don't have any yet.
Right.
When you give a statistic like that, one suspension doubles their chance. And then we look at our criminal justice system, our overflowing prisons, and even the opioid epidemic. I mean, there are so many things that are affected by hopelessness and despair and having a record, being pushed out and marked in some way.
That's right. And if you look at who is being suspended, who is pushed into the criminal justice system and who's incarcerated, it's our black and brown people.
Yes, it is.
You know, our black boys are 3.8 million black boys were suspended. 2.3 million black girls were suspended in 1 year.
And what's interesting about the research done on that is the fact that black girls especially are seen as being far more older. They're seen as older and more promiscuous. I mean, there's all these things.
They're stigmatized. Yes.
They are. And you know, you and I were talking a bit before about bias, whether it's unconscious bias or explicit bias. A lot of people really have not received any training whatsoever in their teaching career.
That's true.
About exploring bias and how that comes to affect how you see the behavior of two children in your classroom differently.
Differently, yes. Studies have been done to show that a black child does appear, I can't remember the specific number, but it does say that the average black child does appear to be so many years older than, you know, your white child. And they look at that as being, oh, well, they should know how to act. Or, oh, they're being violent because they're running down the hallway. But you see a white child running down the hallway,
it's
same behavior, but it's considered to be, oh, he's just joking around, playing around.
Right.
And, you know, Kathy, I'm just going to lay it out there. That's institutional racism.
Yes, I know it is.
You know, and that is exactly what we're trying to bring awareness to so we can solve it. If we don't look at the mess we've made, we can't clean it up. You know, when I spill milk, I'm not going to get a mop and say, you know, I'm going to have to look and see to make sure I got all the milk up. It's time for us to make sure we eradicate this institutional racism and the school to prison pipeline.
Yeah, and it is a major problem here in Virginia. It's something I've done 2 previous shows on school to prison pipeline here,
okay.
and the populations in Virginia are African Americans, people of color, and those in the disability community as well, because autism is so prevalent. And again, teachers who have been put into classrooms have not necessarily received training. They're not specialists, and in trying to deal with students being mainstreamed into their classroom has presented its own unique challenge.
Right, it has. And you know, what has happened is when they started around 2013, when the U.S. Government, the Civil Rights Department started looking at the excessive suspensions, and they said, okay, you need to do something about these suspensions. What they did was they started taking away the suspensions, but they didn't do anything to replace them. So you had teachers who were now being blamed for not being able to handle their classrooms. But the teachers don't get the specific training in teacher preparation schools. So when they go into the classroom, they have no clue about how to de-escalate a situation, about how to help a child move through this emotional breakdown that they may be having because of anxiety. So the teachers were being blamed. And restorative practices, of course, does not blame teachers, does not blame students. It basically works with and it allows them to build relationships so they can work on problem solving together.
And that's what it should be. Things that happen should be a matter of we have a problem and how do we solve it, not we have a problem and who's to blame.
Exactly. Exactly. And too often in this country, we want to look at what rule was broken and what punishment can we give them. With restorative practices, we look at, okay, how was this relationship harmed? And what can we do to hold this person accountable and make it right so they'll know the corrective behavior?
You know, it's interesting. I work a bit with the Bishop Walker School for Boys in Southeast DC, and one of the programs they brought into their lower school was a program started in Canada called The Roots of Empathy.
Oh, okay.
The Roots of Empathy. And so the whole idea, and they bring an actual real live baby into the classroom to help these young children understand, you know, try to assign words and a vocabulary to the emotion, whether the baby's upset or what happens that makes the baby happier. But they have taken part of the school day. This impresses me. And these are predominantly African-American boys, too, from disadvantaged households who go to the Bishop Walker School for Boys. They've actually taken time out of the school day to say, we are going to teach empathy to first, second, and third graders. And yet in the public school, that is not the mindset at all. It's as if the student should arrive knowing how to behave, and that empathy is not important. Somehow they'll get that somewhere from somebody, somewhere along the way. And I don't understand even that, you know, in this day and age, if you look at what employers are looking for, they are looking for people who have soft skills.
Yes.
So how do we teach soft skills? And who's responsible for teaching social and emotional learning if not in the public school system?
Right. It's my belief that teachers bear that responsibility. A lot of teachers I've heard say, "That's not my, job to raise a child. I'm here to teach." But you know what? For many of us, we're with that child more than their parents can be.
More waking hours than their parent is.
That's true. So it is our job to teach the students, because we have the students in a situation where they're with all different types of people, whereas at home, they're just with their nuclear family. So we have that obligation to teach students how to get along with all different types of other students and all different types of people in all different types of situations. So it is our job to do that. Well, and change is very hard. For me, it was hard, but I knew that I needed to do something different. Because sending a student out of my classroom was not helping. The child comes back to my classroom upset with me. So guess what? I'm still the B word, when they come back. And I needed something. And restorative practices and restorative justice is what helped me transform the way I was, change my mindset so I could transform my classroom.
And that is a very interesting point that you make. There's only one person, there's only one situation, there's only one set of factors that we can actually change, and it's ourselves.
Yes.
I talk frequently about we need to look in the mirror instead of out of the window.
Right.
Because it's easy to look out the window and go, oh, the problem's over there. Well, but the only thing we can actually change is the person in the mirror. So I do think mindsets have to change. I think educators at some point individually, if not their school or their school system, educators need to decide that this is the best way to get the best result for the entire classroom.
Right, and that's why punitive doesn't work. Because when you kick a child out, you're expecting them to do what you told them to do. But if they don't already know how to do it, who's going to teach them? So putting them out is not going to make them change their behavior. If anything, the behavior may get worse.
Well, the resentment sets in too, and it hasn't solved the problem.
No, not at all. Not at all. So restorative practice is about discipline, because discipline means to teach.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You know, I heard somebody describe it an interesting way at another panel in St. Louis a couple of years ago, that restorative justice is about a child who doesn't come to class with a pencil. And you're like, you must come to the class with a pencil. And the next day when they don't come to the class with the pencil, they're like, well, we're going to send you to the principal's office. And the principal says you must come to class with a pencil. And when they don't come to class with a pencil, they suspend the child. But nowhere along the way did they ever ask the child why they didn't have a pencil. Right. And to me, that's such a simple explanation of why this current system does not work.
Yeah, but you know what? I wouldn't even ask the question why. I would say, what has happened that you don't bring pencils to class?
And that's a different open-ended question, too.
Yes, it is. Yes,
and I think that comes back to students wanting to know if somebody really cares.
Yes. Yes. There have been situations where students have been put out of class because they didn't have a pencil. So you didn't come to class to learn? You can go sit, you know, in SAC or sit, you know, in ISS or, you know. And guess what? That child's missing the lesson. Academic achievement goes down. Child loses hope. 16 years old, child decides to drop out. All because of that pencil. Now that may sound extreme, but you don't know what's going on in that child's head. You don't know what that child is dealing with at home. So it could be just that one incident that took that child over the edge to say, I'm dropping out.
I know, and I don't think that we are embracing the impact that that one suspension can have on a child. And we don't know the situation at home, and you can't solve every problem. But if somebody's not asking questions about what those children are coming to school already carrying in their backpack emotionally, then we are not going to be effective in teaching them, in my mind, anything.
That's true. And restorative practices will also help your relationship with parents, because a child may not be able to vocalize what's going on with them at home or, you know, in their community. But if you have a good relationship with the parent.
I'm going to talk about home visits when we get back.
Okay.
Please join us after this break. I'm talking with Robin McNair, and the subject is restorative justice and restorative practices in schools. This is something I think anybody who lives in the community truly needs to care about. And we're going to be here after the break to discuss this more in depth with Robin. So please join us.
All the papas out there, let's stop what we're doing and take a moment to be with our kids. They can be loud moments, goofy moments, dorky moments. It doesn't really matter. Every time dads take a moment to be with their kids, it's pretty momentous. So let's all take a moment to make a moment today.
Hey, did you know that 2.4 million loving cats and dogs in shelters and rescues need our help to find a home? Go to theshelterpetproject.org and search your local shelters and rescues. Go for a cuddle with your next best friend. Adopt.
Okay, so we drowned the fire, stirred it, drowned it again, and now just feel if it's cold.
Yeah.
Cool.
Smokey just gave me a bear hug.
I know. I already posted it.
We cannot be bystanders.
We can stop to make sure someone is okay.
We can warn someone when their drink isn't safe.
And disrupt the situation.
We can.
Get someone the cab.
Or walk them home safely.
We can make campuses safer for our friends.
Our roommates.
Our classmates. Our fellow human beings.
We cannot be bystanders.
We can. Intervene.
It's on us.
All of us.
Learn how and take the pledge at itsonus.org.
When it comes to saving money,
What? Parents!
Don't act like a baby.
Oh, it's like they're having their own little meeting.
This is so humiliating. Be the boss. I'm the boss.
What the?
Power nap.
You were saying. And make a budget.
Let's get to work.
Need a little help?
Stacy, read back the notes.
I can't read.
What's it say?
Create a personalized savings plan and get other tools and tips.
We can share.
You obviously didn't go to business school.
At feedthepig.org.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. We are talking about restorative justice and restorative practices with Robin McNair, an educator who has experience in both the classroom and in teaching other people about these practices. Thank you so much for being here, Robin.
Thank you for having me today.
So Abby from McLean gave us a call and said, how does this factor into the whole community school model? Which is very interesting because we don't actually have community schools in Virginia the way, for instance, they have community schools in Maryland.
Okay. So restorative practices and restorative discipline is one of the 6 pillars of community schools, because when you think about community schools, that's exactly what it is, involving your community. So you bring in different facets of the community to help meet the needs of the child, the need of the student, the need of the whole school environment. Parents are involved, they are part of the leadership, and restorative practices is, of course, part of the discipline. And it's not just about discipline, though. It's really about a culture of feeling welcome, a culture of feeling like you belong, you have dignity, respect, people are valued, healthy relationships. So restorative practices is one of the important pillars of a community school.
Well, they have, I know there's like 53 community schools in Baltimore, for instance, and we have 0 here in Virginia. And so I'm hoping that will change. My delegate, Sam Rasool, has put in a bill in this legislative session to look at forming a task force that would help to create a process for creating community schools in Virginia. And so I think this is really important to have this discussion, because restorative practices is a pillar, a very significant pillar of the community school model.
Yes, it is.
And it's also a partnership. I know that the chancellor of the DC Public Schools was on a Brookings Institution panel where he was talking about home visits. Home visits has turned, he said their school system, the DC school system, does more home visits than any school system in the nation. And he has seen significant improvement.
You know, when I first moved here in 1993, I started working Randall Highland Elementary School. And one of the things I did was visited my students' babysitters, because the babysitters lived down the street. So then when I went over to the middle school, I did the same thing. And it was amazing how parents were like, wow, you took the time out to come and tell me about my child. And it meant a lot. And when you reach out into the community is going to reach out for you and help you.
And I think it's a different relationship. We talk about building relationships. There's a book called The Power of Moments that Chip and Dan Heath wrote, and they did a case study on Stanton Elementary School in DC, and how the Flamboyant Foundation gave the school a grant that included the requirement that the teachers go during the summer and sit, no sheets of paper, no contracts, nothing. Just go to the student's house, sit in that living room, and ask those parents what their expectations were for their child, what their challenges were, what their hopes were. That's it, just a free-form conversation. And the first PTA meeting, all these parents showed up that had never come before.
Because they felt welcome. I have a colleague who actually sends a letter home with their students, and it is addressed to the parent, and it says, please tell me about your child. And it allows the student, it allows the parent to tell her about their child.
I think that makes a huge difference.
It does, it really does, because it shows that the teacher cares.
Jane Quinn from the Children's Aid Society in New York at this panel 2 years ago was talking about, they actually oversee 16 community schools in New York City, Washington Heights, South Bronx, and Harlem. And she was talking about the drop-in meetings that they have every morning with the principal or assistant principal, where if you're dropping off your child, you can go and have a cup of coffee or whatever and have I think it's like 30 minutes before school starts with the assistant. But she said on any given morning there's 20 to 40 parents there.
Yes.
And the great thing is that the parents get to know each other in the school community.
That's true. I had a principal who had coffee with their parent.
Isn't that great?
Yeah.
There's so many things to me that I don't think we're considering as being not necessarily using a lot of resources. It's a change of culture, it's a change of mindset, and to me it's a change of priority. How can we prioritize something different?
Because children have to be the priority. Too many people are making decisions about our schools and about our children in our schools who have never stepped foot in a school except to get teachers to vote for them.
There you go.
So there are too many people making decisions about what's best for our students when we should have teachers at the table, parents at the table, that's talking about what's really going on, what's best for our students. And that's what a community school is about, shared leadership. And within that shared leadership, how can we best make sure we're meeting the needs of our students when they show challenging behaviors?
Right. And like, in Fairfax County is, a very affluent county, but we still have 40 Title I elementary schools within the county. And so I work with Grand Involve. We put retired seniors into Title I classrooms. And I actually had somebody ask me at a presentation I was doing once about the program, and the question happened to be, well, have you seen any effect in test scores? Have you seen any effect in test scores? I'm like, well, someday maybe some graduate student will come and plumb the data as to, now that we're 4 years into it with Crestwood Elementary School, they're in their 4th year. I said, you know what I care about? Here's what I care about. Have we reduced disciplinary actions and school suspensions? Because I said, I think that would be easier to figure out in a short amount of time with the available data. I said, I want to know if having 40 volunteers at Crestwood Elementary School in the 2017-2018 school year impacts the disciplinary record in that school.
And I can tell you from that study that you're going to do, the achievement's going to go up. Because if students are in school, they're learning.
Right.
And if they're learning, the academic achievement will go up. People don't realize that, like I said earlier, social and emotional learning. Social and emotional skills and meeting those needs will allow the academic skills to improve as well.
And we're not making that connection. I don't understand why we're not making that connection, because it's so obvious in life as adults that you can be the most technically gifted person in the world, but if you have poor communication skills, you don't read social cues, you can't communicate effectively, you can't run a meeting, you can't form trusted relationships among your colleagues, then what do you really have to offer?
True. And where are we supposed to learn these skills?
Right. So tell me a little bit about, because I'm talking about restorative justice and restorative practices.
Yes.
Explain those two terms and what they mean.
Well, restorative justice basically started even before it was called restorative justice, because it started from the indigenous cultures where they would use the circle process to deal with the harm that took place in the community, to make a decision that they needed to make within the community. And some people decided around 1970 to take that same concept into the criminal justice system, and they deemed it restorative justice, because it's really about restoring a person back into society. They realized that the penal system was not doing its job.
Yeah, that's an
figure, right?
Yeah.
And they did a couple of, I don't want to call them experiments, but they did a couple of meetings where they brought in, victims and offenders or people who've committed crimes, and they've actually talked to them about the harm that they had done. And many of these offenders had never realized how they harmed other people. And once they saw that, then of course they became remorseful, and the recidivism rate for many of those inmates who were released dropped.
Right.
Yeah. So it was doing so well, and Nancy Reisenberg, who is actually out of Minnesota, she was one of the pioneers that actually took restorative justice into the schools and applied it to discipline.
So that book, Circle in the Square?
Circle in the Square.
Circle in the Square. So you would recommend this as like a primer for people who are interested in knowing more about how this developed and how it was brought from a larger concept to a school concept?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Circle in the Square. Okay.
Yeah.
Note that.
She is one of my mentors. And so once she brought it into the schools and they used it for disciplinary reasons, they realized that, okay, yeah, we're using it for disciplinary, but wouldn't it be more effective if we also used it proactively? So they started doing processes that allowed prevention to take place. So when you build these relationships and you have these restorative conversations and you have restorative language at the bottom, then it prevents a lot of the harm, and it prevents your tier 3, which is your more intense, conflicts.
So is this where the concept of restorative circles comes in?
Yes.
So when you have a circle, and I've read a bit about this, about the kinds of questions that you can ask, the talking piece, so that everybody gets a chance to both talk and be heard, which is really important, because not every person's an extrovert. I am, but you know, so I didn't have a problem talking in class. But there's a lot of children at whatever age they are who are not going to feel like they have something to say, or they're going to be nervous or reluctant to say something, and so they stay quiet.
Right. You know, Kathy, with restorative practices, I know within my classroom, a lot of students who didn't talk in the class when I was instructing the class, they wouldn't raise their hand, they didn't join into discussion. It was almost like pulling teeth. They would actually talk during circle time, during community circles.
Because here's the difference, you know, a lot of people don't want to raise their hand, get the answer wrong, and be humiliated or embarrassed.
Right.
But in a circle time, when the questions are of an open-ended nature, like I think one of the ones I saw was like, what superhero do you most admire and why? That's a question that anyone can answer. Anybody can have an opinion, and it's not a right or wrong opinion.
Right.
But it starts to build a trust relationship around getting to know the people.
It does, it does. And when you think about restorative circles, the first thing you have to do is you have to get acquainted. You have to build that trust. And once you build the trust, it's easier to problem solve. It's easier to handle the harder situations because that child knows you care about them.
Trust relationships, and that means trusting your classmates too.
Yes.
Right? So we're actually, seems to me the restorative circles are teaching them the building blocks of adult relationships, which is without trust, you don't have a relationship.
Exactly.
So as a leader in these circles, you know, how do you draw the kids out to higher level conversations when you're being proactive and not addressing something that happened?
Right. Normally, if something has happened, a child would come to me and say, we need a circle. If I see that the class may be getting a little rowdy, a little talkative, I would do a circle on the class temperature. So we would start out, you know, with the icebreaker where you do a fun activity. And then I would say, you know, how do you think the class temperature has been? I would ask questions in reference to instruction, talking, and children would be honest. That's one thing children are, honest about how they feel, you know, with instruction. Students are talking too much. And, you know, of course, what do we do to solve it? And then they would say we need to be more respectful. What does that look like? What does being more respectful look like? Well, when Ms. McNair's talking, don't talk. And I write that down. And at the end, we all have to, by consensus, agree, when Ms. McNair's talking, don't talk.
You know, and I think those are great, very specific things to address. If people have never done something like this before, perhaps this is something you can ease your way into. When we return from this break, we are going to talk in our last segment about some prescriptive things that maybe we can incorporate into our classrooms. So please join us after the break.
You made your house a reality. Homeschooling yourself on loans, color-coding listings, and flushing every toilet in a 20-mile radius. If you can ace house hunting, you can do it for retirement. Get on track with tips at aceyourretirement.org.
Here's to the things that can keep us safe. Those we use all the time with hardly a thought. Those that are silently standing by to save our lives. And now, those that we carry with us everywhere we go. Many mobile devices will now bring you wireless emergency alerts, real-time information directly from local sources you know and trust. With the unique sound and vibration, you'll be in the know.
Listen, I realize that I'm not perfect, but it all really started to change because you judge me for having a problem. No one is going to know that I need help. I need help. I know that no one is going to judge me for having a problem. I realize that I'm not perfect, but it all really started to change because you listen.
Family.
Whether it's a short trip or a long haul.
Estimated time, 47 hours.
They will beg.
You're hungry? I'm happy to provide.
They will plead.
Deep fried butter on a stick.
But whatever you do, don't wimp out.
Now you're talking?
Make them buckle up.
He can't hurt.
Remember, safety first. Cheese curls second.
Are you orange?
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and we're talking about restorative justice and restorative practices with Robin McNair, an educator and a consultant who has a lot of background in not only doing this in her classroom, but also teaching other teachers how to do this. So I promised that we would be proscriptive in our final segment, Robin.
Okay.
What advice do you have for people who may not have read the book or had the training? How would you start easing some of these ideas into a group of children?
Okay, so for an educator, I will basically have them to do a self-reflection. You know, how do you relate to your students? And be honest about it. You know, how do you yell at your students? Do you say offensive words such as shut up, get out? Are you sarcastic with students? But really being self-reflective. And then when you want to change your mindset within the classroom and change the culture in your classroom, you've got to start with your behavior as an educator. Do you stand at the door when your students come in? And do you speak to them by their name? There's a social worker who works at Skinner Middle School in Denver. Every day he's out in front of the school, he greets every child by their name.
Wow.
This is a school of about 600 students.
That's
so
a lot.
Each child that comes to that front door, hi Tommy, how are you? You know, hi George, hi Becky, you know, hi Melinda. So he does that. So are you speaking to your children? When you talk with your children, your students, are you looking them in the face? You know, are you answering their questions? Or are you being sarcastic? So start looking at your students. Start answering their questions. Speak to them. Be vulnerable. For example, use effective statements. It's very easy to say, put your phone away. I said, put your phone away. But maybe if you changed your language and said, you know, it really makes me upset that you're on your phone because I really prepared this lesson specifically for you and your classmates.
Right.
You're basically being vulnerable. You're showing your human side. You know, I had to tell a student one day, you know what? I'm starting to get very frustrated because I'm trying to get through this lesson before the bell rings and you're continuing to talk. You know, you got it, Miss McNair, you got it. And they'll stop talking. So using effective statements, using I statements, instead of pointing and saying you did this, you did that, talk about how it's making you feel. Talk about how you're being affected. I'll ask them the question, you know, now you want to make sure when you address them for a behavior that they're doing, sometimes it's best to pull them out to the side and talk to them. So you really have to gauge the situation. But you ask them, you know, how do you think, you know, your group mates feel about you not participating when it's a group activity? And have them start thinking about how other people are feeling. When it comes down to the circle process, I really, really advise educators to be trained on how to do the circle process. Because one of the things about a circle is that it's equality in a circle. So that means that everyone's on the same level. In my circles, my students call me Robin.
Okay.
When we first start out, they're like, you know, because they're so used to Miss McNair. But I let them know, you know, in circle, this is a different way of being. I'm Robin in circle. When I'm up there teaching, I'm Miss McNair. And they eventually get used to it. But you're on an equity basis. And the question that you ask your young people, you answer also, you know. But you want to make sure that you're trained because circles can also be oppressive for students. So if you don't know how to ask those questions and you don't know when to back off or when to send another round because a student is hesitant or when not to send another round, it can become oppressive. That's one of the problems that I had when I was first trained. I was trained once. And I went back into my classroom and, you know, they wasn't used to being in that space. So I started getting frustrated and wanting to be in control, you know. And I was trained again. As a matter of fact, I've gone through like several trainings, but I was trained again, and in the new training that I received, it was about equity in the process. It was about value. It was about making sure the students are valued. It was about rituals and making sure you had a routine when you did your circles. So it's very important to make sure you follow the indigenous culture and how they did the circle process, because you don't want your circles to be oppressive. Because if your circles are oppressive, guess what? That introverted student's not going to share. So you may not get an opportunity to know what's going on with that student.
You know, it's interesting, the whole symbolism of the circle, and I didn't realize that this came from the practices of indigenous people, but I always think about the Knights of the Round Table and how King Arthur always considered himself first among equals, but he always had a round table. Like, he was King Arthur, but still there was equity in that circle, that he was simply the first among equals. And so I think that's a tremendous symbolism. I really like that concept a lot.
Right, nobody's hidden in a circle. So you as an educator are able to gauge your students by looking at each and every one of your students. And your students look at you and see that you're intently listening to what they have to say. That makes a difference.
And isn't that too part of this whole movement about mindfulness and being fully present?
Yes, it is. Because one of the guidelines is remain in circle. That doesn't mean physically remain in circle. That means mentally remain in circle.
Be there and be present.
Be there and be present.
And I know, just as a sideline, that meditation is also being, and again, I think Baltimore schools have introduced the idea of meditation.
They have.
You know, I think a lot of people in general and children are not accustomed to being alone with their own thoughts.
Right. It's called mindfulness. When you do it in circle, it's called mindfulness, and you take a minute to just be still, you know, and just to breathe. And there's different ways that you can do that, but it's so important for children to kind of get themselves prepared for that space.
I think we live in a time too where we are overstimulated all the time. It's music, it's your phone, it's your smartphone, it's the television, it's the radio, it's talking, it's constant. I think really stillness, silence, mindfulness, being fully where you are is really starting to escape all of us. I think all of us are to the point where it's just, we go from one thing to the next thing to the next thing to the next thing.
Right, multitasking.
Yeah.
That's what they call it.
And it's really, and I don't think anybody ever really multitasks very well. So
no, I don't.
I think you have another book that you were talking about, which is a very good sort of first book too.
Anybody who's interested in wanting to know more about, you know, restorative justice, restorative discipline, I recommend any of the little books.
Okay.
The little books of restorative discipline in schools, and you also have the little book of restorative justice in education. Now, this is one of the newer books that has come out to basically talk about how restorative justice have pushed into education and how it's about creating equity and just environments, creating healthy, nurturing relationships, and being able to repair harm and conflict in a restorative way. So these are two great books that I definitely want to encourage people to get.
And again, I think we have to introduce a vocabulary and concepts. I don't know how we can have a productive conversation about restorative justice and restorative practices if people don't even understand what those terms mean, or if we can't talk about things like equity and mindfulness and openness and trust relationships. And so, you know, we are producing the adults of tomorrow every time a preschooler or a kindergartner sets foot in a classroom, sets foot inside a school community. And so to me, I'm hoping that we're looking at the beginning of a movement.
Yes, it's a movement.
I think it's a movement. I don't think it's a moment. I think restorative justice in education and in the classroom is a movement. And I think we just need to spread this word more to educators and to the people who decide about professional development too. Because how many schools are actually giving the time and the resources to provide this sort of professional development training for teachers?
Right, that's true. And the thing about your training with restorative justice, it's a 4-day training. It's an intense all-day 4-day training to be fully trained in restorative practices.
Well, I know that there are people who do that. When I was at a conference recently in Richmond, it was a 2-day conference called Strengthening Connections, and it was actually, believe it or not, the Virginia Criminal Justice Division that put this on.
Okay.
And a lot of it was about communications training. It was about taking a DISC test to understand how you communicate. It was really a lot about trust relationships. It was aimed at social workers and teachers and school resource officers. But it was the dynamics of trying to understand more fully what we can do inside schools that are going to produce a different result than what we have right now.
Right. If you keep doing the same thing you've been doing, you'll be the same person that you've always been.
Right.
And if we're about evolving and changing, then we've got to do something different, specifically in our schools. And if we want a different outcome, we've got to put something different in.
And in your opinion, I mean, is this something that there should be a line item somewhere to give both resources and training to classroom teachers and to administrators?
Yes. Now that's one of the things about sustainability with restorative practices, that you're going to need the funding. Because it does take the training and it takes the ongoing professional development. Things change, trends change, and you need to always keep it fresh in your mind. So the funding to have a restorative practices coordinator within the school, that is going to be a whole school, restorative school. You need to have the resources to have books for your educators. You need to make sure you have the resources to have district coordinators, money to send teachers to training. So it takes funding.
There you go.
To sustain this
And what about collecting data? You know, we love measuring things.
Yes.
Test scores and matrices about whatever, but it seems to me we are not necessarily looking at things like investing in social and emotional learning, and to your point, how that is tied to achievement, keeping kids in school longer, getting them out of school and onto other kinds of education, making them workforce ready. Workforce ready is the new hot term right now.
Right. Data is very important. For example, Oakland public schools in California actually have restorative schools, and they have seen a 60% increase in their graduation rate because of implementing restorative practices.
See, and to me, that's the final outcome. You know, test scores aside, you've got to get the kids educated with a diploma and out the door on graduation day.
That's right.
That has to be a goal.
And it also helps with teacher
retention.
Yes. Yes.
You know, that's one of the other things, and this came up earlier, is that we have a high burnout rate among teachers. They all seem to be in their 20s. I mean, they all seem to be in their 20s, which means we are not retaining veteran teachers over the long term. So I really see that as a challenge. And I see this, again, I'm interested in community schools. I see how this fits in with so many of the other things that make that model work.
Yes.
I cannot thank you enough for being here, Robin. You have been a source
It's been my pleasure.
You've been a great resource for me, because I am not an expert and you are an expert. And I hope that we brought our viewers something of interest. So I hope you got a lot out of this. We've got books to read. You've got Robin's website for more information. And please, you know, consider pushing this idea that we need to invest in the social and emotional learning of our children in our public school systems. Thanks so much for joining us tonight on Inside Scoop.